a key part of my job is actually I get to help coordinate and lead beaver mediated habitat restoration efforts throughout the state of Idaho. So that's is giving me a lot of opportunity to just really dive into this. And I'm honestly, it's probably my favorite part of my position. And before Idaho, I was a biologist for the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. If any of you all spend any time in New England, you can imagine that beaver and beaver management is kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum there. Tons of animals, and a lot of experience I gained there was learning the where and what opportunities existed in relation to non-lethal control efforts related to, flood control primarily. And then as far as how today, I'm also part of AFWA's Fur Bear Conservation Technical Working Group, and I'm a Western representative for that working group. And today, I'll obviously pull heavily from Idaho, but I'm speaking on behalf of this working group, which is a collaboration of tribal, federal, state biologists across the country. And we work to address a variety of fur bearer management and policy related issues. Next slide, please.
Oh, Cory, before we advance, can you please tell me again what the FCT working group was? I didn't catch that.
Okay, it's the Fur Bearer Conservation Technical Working Group.
I like that. Technical. Okay, here we go. Come on now. Yeah, there.
All right, so for today's talk, I'm sure, inevitably, y'all have gotten some of this information before, but I just real quickly want to kind of touch on the natural history and management of the species from like a state management or applied management perspective. Talk a little bit about one step to back up, is preparing for this presentation. I reached out to a variety of state agency biologists and managers that I knew were doing this type of work and kind of picked their brains about what they thought would be most valuable to share with a group like this. And with that in mind, after we get done with the natural history and kind of the applied management of beaver, I'm going to talk a little bit about beaver habitat versus dam habitat. I think that's a common problem we see with a lot of efforts that are just getting started related to beaver or beaver mimicry as a restoration tool, and go through a variety of things like to consider when using beaver as a restoration tool, the political, social, biological challenges that various states have ran into. And I think the earlier, if you're getting a program off the ground, I wish I would have known all of these things when I started 3.5, 4 years ago, and then kind of tying it all together with some examples in Idaho, because that's what I'm most familiar with. Next slide, please. All right, so beaver, absolutely fascinating, right? They extend from the edge of the boreal forest to the north all the way south of the Rio Grande River, and coast to coast. So within that, you have a wide array of habitat types that they can successfully inhabit. They're a territorial species, and they have a colony that could be anywhere from 2 to 10 individuals, and that male and female, they pair bond and usually mate for life. Litter size can be anywhere from 2 to 6, and they reach sexual maturity at around 1.5 to 3 years. And a lot of that is dependent on resource availability and density. So, and that really ties in when we start discussing about the harvest of beaver. All right, next slide. So when it comes to managing beaver in the West, but probably across the country as a whole, it's not a federally listed species. There's not a whole lot of nexus from the federal government. So beaver as a species really are managed under state and tribal authority, and they're usually classified as a fur bearer. And while that obviously the season structure and timing all varies by state, that generally means that you have to have a license to harvest the animal. There's a opening and closing of the season. outside, if you harvest animals outside of that season, let's say damage or nuisance reasons. The policies behind that vary widely by state, and I think you all got to dive into all of that yesterday when you got the state by state reports. For example, in Idaho, if you want to remove beaver for any reason outside of our harvest season, you have to do it. You have to apply for a kill permit or a removal permit, and then that's issued by the state. Whereas in other states, it might be as easy as if it's on private property and they're causing damage, then you can just remove them without any permitting. All right, next slide, please. Oh, back, please. All right. Yeah, so one key thing to think about here when it comes to harvest of the species and how harvest may or may not interact with our larger efforts of using beaver to restore riparian habitat is that this is a species that exhibits density-dependent reproduction. What I mean by that is when beaver are near carrying capacity, the literature suggests that litter sizes are smaller. Animals wait longer to reproduce, and they are older before they disperse. So what that means is that there's some plasticity in the management of this species. So some, suggesting that it's actually a varying level of harvest is sustainable. And the literature suggests anywhere from 20 to 40% of a population can be harvested annually and not cause a population decline. And that's all because of that plasticity in their reproductive and social structure. And that makes beaver as a whole pretty resilient to a regulated harvest like what we have in our country today. Also, in most states that I've spoken with, the overall state harvests tend to be very low in comparison to available habitat and how that habitat could be extrapolated into potential population sizes. All right, next slide, please. So this is something that I kind of struggled with when I first came and started doing this work, or especially when working with some of our partners, is what is beaver habitat? And this is obviously a hugely important part of the discussion. And, with conversations of fur bearer biologists and habitat biologists across the states, it seems that there's oftentimes a misconception on what this is. And what we're here, I think, when we talk about beaver and their ability to make watersheds more resilient to climate change, and therefore all of the habitat goals that you could have are addressed through restoring beaver to a riparian system. Teasing these two apart is really, really important. Next slide, please. Oh, back.
Oh, it's over. There you go.
So I'm going to pull heavily from just examples that I've gotten from different partners across the state. But what I'm talking about here, what is beaver habitat versus beaver dam habitat, is that we see a lot of streams. I'll use Idaho, for example, where they are that.
Uh-oh, Cory, we lost you.
Uh-oh.
Oh, shoot.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Jackie, it looks like a few people can still hear me.
I can hear you, Cory.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll just keep trudging forward. How about that?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay, great. So what I'm getting at with this beaver habitat versus beaver dam habitat is that, we know that beavers really don't build dams unless they absolutely have to. It's an innate ability that the species has, and they're only going to build that dam if it's needed to create the right water depths and promote the right type of woody and herbaceous vegetation that they need for foraging. And Something that we've ran into a lot initially here in Idaho when we started using the BRAT tool, which is an amazing resource that we use extensively, is that we'll have a lot of streams that classify out as suitable for beaver dam building activity. And you go to these streams and they are a mid-order stream. They have a low possibility of like spring blowouts. But when you start walking these streams, there may be very little in terms of vegetation. You'll have closed canopy, conifer, forest all the way to the stream bank. So there's absolutely no suitable forage for the species. Or when it comes to these translocations, if we're not partnering with something like building BDAs or other structures to help deepen the pools, you may have a stream that ranks out well and may look good at first glance to biologists or managers because it has an abundant riparian vegetation component, of herbaceous vegetation and deciduous browse. And it is a perennial higher order stream. But if that water is uniformly knee deep, that's not going to be a very good site to release beavers without something else to help boost them along the way. And so I think what it really gets down to is that we're focused on, or what we often see is that we as a body of conservationists are very interested in having beavers build dams in these streams. And we get so focused on the fact that we need these dams in the streams to address these wide array of habitat goals that we're missing some of the nuance that the species needs to be successful. And one little, factoid to help tie some of this together is through discussions with our a colleague of mine in Oregon, who's the fur bearer and carnivore biologist. Some work in Western Oregon, 75% of the mid-order streams that, based on best guesses or, best professional opinion, all those streams were suitable for dam building activities. And of those streams, 74% of the streams that had beaver in them had no evidence of dam building activity. So, what I'm getting at here is that I don't fully understand all the nuance that goes into this, like why beavers do or do not build dams. And, we think we understand it pretty well, but I think when you go to using them as a restoration tool, it's really, you got to really think about ecologically, does this have what the beaver needs to, one, survive, and two, force that animal to build a dam in the first place. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this is where I think was most interesting to me. And, this will be just kind of a bunch of examples that I've gathered from Western states related to translocations. And this is beaver focused, so the species itself, but that inevitably gets a little messy to me because oftentimes beaver translocations may be partnered with putting in beaver dam analogs or other low-tech process-based restoration efforts. And a lot of these challenges or discussions that I'm going to walk through are almost interchangeable. And, these subjects can be kind of lumped into the biological, social, legal, which was a very surprising piece to me coming from New England, where more the goal is like try to keep things from getting wet as opposed to trying to save water. Our federal land management agencies, that's a very big component that I was pretty naive of, and I think a lot of us are when we start. And then the last is from the fur bearer management and people who sustainably harvest and utilize beaver and other wildlife species. All right, so next slide, please. So what to think about, what are the policy biological considerations when translocating beaver? These are some of the common concerns that we keep hearing come up across states. Obviously, it's that beaver habitat need that I discussed earlier and how the needs of the species may or may not align well with the goals of building dams in a specific stretch of stream. One thing that we've been really concerned here in Idaho, and I've heard it voiced repeatedly across Western states is how, these really great intentions of moving beaver, can we unintentionally transmit other aquatic diseases to wildlife, such as chytrid or whirling disease, ranavirus, tularemia in beaver populations and muskrat populations themselves. And, states have taken a wide array of approaches to address that. Here in Idaho, a lot of discussion has been focused on chytrid and whirling disease. And with chytrid, we kind of work under the assumption that, unless we have a very specific isolated population of amphibian, let's take western toad, for example, where we're very concerned about the viability of that population, we'll often work under the assumption that we'll work to minimize that disease transmission by drying beavers out, quarantining them before we translocate them. But, unless there's a very specific set of circumstances associated with that amphibian, we're working under the assumption that improving habitat is going to be more of a net gain to the species than maybe accidentally introducing chytrid, especially since, when you speak of chytrid as a genus, it's widespread throughout most of the West. And then whirling disease, one can start dissecting the life history of that disease and the requirement of a snail host and whether or not your streams have that host. So there's ways to deconstruct or reduce that threat. Another one is aquatic invasive plants and invertebrates, particularly mussels and aquatic milfoil, things like that. One thing that has been challenging here in Idaho is the concerns that beaver, if we're moving beavers with the goal of altering habitat and building dams, while that may be a net positive for the system, where we have listed anadromous fish, salmon and steelhead, or listed resident fish like bull trout, non-native brook trout, unfortunately, do great throughout much of the Intermountain West. And again, it's the argument, well, we're providing more overall in-stream habitat for those listed fish by introducing beaver and them successfully altering that in-stream habitat. But when you're dealing with isolated populations or low population sizes that are being threatened by an abundant resident brook trout population, maybe, while overall, your overall average would be a net gain in that system, you could have localized pronounced effects, by increasing all of this ponded habitat and increasing the brook trout population that could either predate on a certain life cycle of that listed fish species or outcompete them or hybridize with them. And, this is a great opportunity where our research has not quite met the management needs of understanding how those factors interact. Another example that we have of things to consider is how these beaver dams may impede movement of some fish populations. When I first heard this, I immediately wanted to discredit it because my thought is resident fish in the West co-evolved with beaver. If they couldn't move over or through a dam, it's probably been an issue for quite some time at this point. It would have sorted itself out. And again, I think overall, yes, most definitely, that is the case. But again, an example that I'm going to use here is in Montana. So you have small resident populations of native grayling in streams, and they have all the challenges that we talk about with species of concern. Small populations, isolated, habitat issues. And so while overall beaver dam and increasing that in-stream structural diversity through beaver dam activities may be a net gain, locally, on that local scale, it may negatively impact that population, even of grayling, even if it is only for a little while. But when you're dealing with small isolated populations, that short-term potential negative benefit is or negative consequence is something that is a real issue. And I think it's something, we should all be thinking of when we're moving these animals or wanting to move these animals. Next slide, please. All right, things to consider socially. It sounds like later on today, you'll have someone speaking specifically to the social side of moving beavers, and I'm sure, and hopefully they'll touch to a much greater detail than I'm going to here. But, at least here in Idaho, and I think it's in a lot of states where we don't have this species currently, and we're wanting to move the animal, the very thing that makes this species amazing is the same thing that can cause real challenges to landowners, transportation infrastructure. And so at least here in Idaho, we've really focused on only working in streams, even if we're working on public land, where we know we have positive, strong relationships with landowners, grazing permittees, and, speaking early and often with all of the transportation infrastructure, whether it's the county department or the state highway department, to discuss these concerns up front and try and find places where we have willing participants to work on translocating beaver. Next slide, please. All right, so the legal side, and again, this was something that was really fascinating to me when I first came out here. Water rights. All of you all, I'm sure, are familiar with this concept, but the water rights law can vary widely by state. So here in Idaho, beavers, it's specifically written in statute that if they are impeding if they are perceived to be impeding a water right, it is our obligation to go and remove those animals and breach those dams. And that, obviously can impede all of our well-intended and successful restoration efforts. Again, that goes back to making sure we have willing participants, especially in the beginning stages, as this technique is growing in popularity, to before we start moving these animals. Some states I've spoken with, the state, the way their laws are written is that the state agency could be considered liable if they move beaver and that beaver moves downstream and clogs up a water diversion that causes crop failure. The state agency could be held legally liable for that damage to private property. And then I think one of the biggest challenges, at least that what we're running into here in Idaho, is ESA, or the Endangered Species Act. And not that that's a bad thing at all, but when it comes to even just moving a species, we're moving the species under state management authority with the goal of altering listed critical habitat for salmon, steelhead, and bull trout. And with that comes a whole laundry list of legal and policy requirements and issues before we can move forward with translocating animals in any of these streams. And we'll talk more about that with land management agencies. Next slide, please. All right, so, and then the last thing is working with our federal land management partners. I'm guessing Colorado's not a whole lot different, that a lot of the opportunity we see for beaver-mediated habitat restoration exists on these state and federally managed lands. And, working with various forests and BLM districts throughout Idaho, there's an impressive amount of variety in how this activity can be interpreted by each individual jurisdiction. And that has led our efforts here in Idaho to range anything from a simple email and site visit to an 18-month EIS where the department paid, tens of thousands of dollars to partner with a consulting firm to write the environmental impact statement for the BLM district before we could move forward with any restoration efforts, including just translocating animals. And I think, I'm sure many of you all are more familiar with that as it relates to building beaver dam analogs or other process-based restoration efforts, but we've ran into a lot of this, and other states have as well, just with moving animals, because you're doing that with the goal of using a species to alter habitat. Next slide, please. All right, and then the last thing, the fur bearer management side. Harvesting beaver is an important part of many state agency programs, and that harvest is used to provide outdoor opportunity for people, an opportunity to sustainably utilize wildlife. We use it to manage beaver for a wide array of reasons. And when this topic comes up of using beaver to restore and improve riparian habitat, this often promotes a lot of interest from groups that have concerns about harvest or the sustainable use of wildlife. And, we've seen where this sometimes can take the goals of a project of addressing riparian habitat needs, getting mired in the weeds related to whether or not beaver should or shouldn't be harvested, can really take these restoration efforts kind of sideways. And there seems to be interest in that, even when there's the data by the state management agencies does not support, there's no evidence to suggest that the harvest is causing any sort of population absences or declines in the target area. And at least here in Idaho, we've worked early and often with our trapping constituents, and they've proven to be some of our largest allies, whether it's actually trapping and translocating the animals themselves. All three of our trappers associations have agreed to be on signage that we use at our translocation sites that, is like an info piece explaining people why we're moving beaver, asking them not to trap the animals. And, they actively advocate for beaver restoration efforts across the state. And so they've proven to be an important component to Idaho's efforts. Next slide, please. All right, so to wrap it all up, all together, I came into the state of Idaho right when we started using beaver as a habitat restoration tool, at least on a large scale. And in 4 years, it quickly got very complicated. We discussed whether it's issues with water rights or NEPA consultation, or finding willing partners and private landowners to work with. But something that I think I've learned through trial and error, and I've heard this again repeated in other states, thinking of all of these things and then including everyone early and often has been the best way I've found to get new efforts off the ground. And alienating any of these groups, I can personally attest that they've derailed success, and as far as we've had to uninstall projects that we initially put in because we did not check all of these boxes in the beginning. Next slide, please. Well, I feel like I'm kind of running late on time, so I feel like I kind of tied a lot of that. Do what?
You're okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so for an example, here in Idaho, we've been working a lot in a small mountain range in southwestern Idaho to address red band trout, Columbian spotted frog, and sage-grouse habitat needs with beaver-mediated habitat restoration. And it's been a really solid success in terms of initially getting those habitat projects implemented on the ground. I think whether or not we'll see the touted results, only time will tell. But that has involved an immense amount of legal and social due diligence. We've really found influential and willing participants in the cattle industry, ranchers that want these species on their property and are interested in all the benefits that they can provide, and working with them, attending cattle grazing association meetings, chairing panel discussions at the Idaho Range Conservation Partnership meetings, and really talking about why this is important, how it can benefit livestock operations, as well as all these important habitat goals. That is kind of tied into a lot of these streams. It goes back to whether it's beaver habitat or beaver dam habitat. A lot of the places we're finding, or that where we want to do this work, historically held beaver, or at least for some point in time, because you can find really old residual structures in these streams. But for whatever reason, those streams no longer hold beaver, and we don't think hold the habitat suitable to make them successful. And so, we've done a lot of the BDA work and other low-tech process-based restoration efforts first to help push the habitat in the right direction before we move in with beaver translocations. We've partnered this with a lot of intensive radio monitoring of translocated animals to try and better understand what are the factors that improve the success and when it comes to translocating beavers to improve riparian and in-stream habitat. And that's been really crucial to shape our understanding. I'll say, we're only 2-3 years into it right now. We've moved about 50, 60 animals and have been able to monitor about 40 of those. And what we're seeing for survival and movement rates, I think really they definitely are shaping how we are moving forward with other translocation efforts. And I think anytime a group can tie that in an adaptive management framework where, we have picked the watershed, we are with a goal of restoring beaver to it to address those habitat needs. The data we are getting from survival and movement patterns of those translocated animals is it is completely rewrote the way we think about it. Most specifically, that it takes a lot more animals from our efforts than we first thought, and that it seems to take more time for those animals to start building dams than we originally thought. And at least in the Oahes, in a positive direction, is that the animals are not moving nearly as far as we had originally thought. The vast majority of our animals stay within half a mile of where they were released initially, and if not, they usually end up and die through predation or primarily they're almost always predated on. That's our leading cause of mortality with these translocated animals. And so that's actually, using that data has helped make the land management agency, the Bureau of Land Management, much more comfortable with translocating beaver, because we can demonstrate that, look, we're following these animals. We know you have downstream concerns related to infrastructure or archaeology, or cultural resources, and we're pretty confident these animals aren't going to move more than a half, 3/4 of a mile. And that actually this year opened up a whole new suite of potential project areas that we have been stymied with our federal land management partner up to that point. But being able to provide that data really helped focus or make them feel more comfortable with taking this risk with us. So I think, to me, I'm talking about it over and over, but one of the biggest components to me is, especially early on when you're working in a new system, that monitoring component has been incredibly helpful to addressing a lot of those needs related to being successfully translocating animals. All right, next slide. All right, that's all I have. Jackie, are we going to do questions now or wait until everyone else is done?
We're going to wait to the end. So
Okay.
I know that we've got some questions that came in, and I've got some questions. That was really great. A lot of really good information, Cory. Thanks very much.